Hi, my name is Ren, and welcome to my booktube channel. And happy daylight savings. To mark this auspicious occasion of us getting an hour back, I thought it would be a great time to recommend to you 3 of my favorite reads of all time that I think really fit this daylight savings vibe. And by that I mean some sort of autumnal, time warp, fading sunlight type of situation. Because what better way to spend the extra hour than to read a really good book? So I'm going to recommend to you 3 books today. These 3 books have some really powerful similarities. The first one being that they are probably some of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. They have some of the most hauntingly gorgeous prose that I've ever encountered that feel both like the ethereal glow of golden hour and the sort of tinge of somberness that I feel like always accompanies twilight or fading sunlight. And on that note, they also all feature light and time in really important and forwarded ways that I think is perfect for daylight savings. And I think that they are all underrated classics by famous authors. So you'll recognize these authors and you might have read some of their other pieces, but I think that these works specifically are, in my opinion, maybe even better than their more famous masterpieces. For this video, I'm going to be giving a quick introduction into each of these 3 books in quick succession, and then talk about the connections that I feel like these 3 have with each other that I've derived, or you might argue contrived. And then finally, I'll conclude with a bit of a book review of each of the books in case any of them piqued your interest. So the first recommendation that I have for you is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This is the first of Hardy's great novels. It's his 4th published novel, but his first commercial success. And it's essentially the quintessential English countryside pastoral novel. It features a young, independent female farmer named Bathsheba Everdeen and her 3 suitors. Virginia Woolf says about this novel, quote, "The subject is right, the method was right, the poet and the countryman, and all enlisted to produce a book which must hold its place among the great English novels." And speaking of Virginia Woolf, the second book recommendation that I'll be giving to you is, of course, yes, of Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. This novel follows Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, their children, and some guests as they are on their vacation in the Isle of Skye. It follows a sort of seemingly trivial postponement of a journey to the lighthouse. Part 1 of To the Lighthouse is entitled The Window, which connects to the final book that I'll be recommending to you today, which is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. This novel is incredibly subversive and has a non-traditional narrative structure, but at the heart of it, it is a 999-line poem split into 4 cantos with heroic couplets. The first couplet that opens this poem is by far some of my most favorite lines that I've ever read in both poetry and prose, and it reads, "I was the shadow of the waxwing slain by the false azure in the window pane." Amazing. Anyway, so Window of Virginia Woolf connects to the window pane of Pale Fire. I think that windows, and especially lighted windows, the Victorian concept, are a common theme actually among these 3 novels. And even more broadly, I think these 3 novels feature light in really beautiful and foregrounded ways. Sunlight, moonlight, the light of a candle flame, the lighted window, and also its illumination, refraction, and reflection of that light in the ever-changing and yet ever-present light of human nature. All 3 feature this sort of somber, poignant beauty, and I think that's owing not just to the author's wield of their prose, but also their content. I think all of them deal with love and loss and senses of grief and yearning really well in this sort of silent desperation that I think characterize all 3 of these novels. And finally, I think that these novels also share a really special and distinctive motion to them. So this motion is back and forth. It's like a pendulum. It's like the ebbing and flowing of a tide, crashing and receding waves. And they all do it slightly differently, but they all are very marked by this motion. In Far from the Madding Crowd, Hardy does this by alternating between descriptions of nature and human nature. So when he talks about nature, he dips into these really frenzied descriptions of the wind, for example, whipping through the English countryside. But then when he talks about the characters, even though inside they're experiencing a lot of turmoil, outside their actions are very stagnant, still, even frustrated. And I think for To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, she does this by her focalization. She pans like a camera, zooms in and out in between the characters' minds, and the focalization is always moving and really characteristic of this novel. And Pale Fire by Nabokov does it quite literally through flipping through pages. The novel at its core features this poem, but there are line-by-line notes and annotations written by another fictional character that are in the back. And so as you're reading the poem, you are flipping to the notes. And the notes section actually features an entirely different story. We'll get more into that later. In the end, all three of them in their very distinct ways have the sort of back and forth motion that I think is honestly very apropos as we sort of go back in time today for daylight savings. So now I hope I piqued your interest in some of these novels, and I'm gonna go novel by novel, just giving you some takes that I have about it. So first, on to Far from the Madding Crowd. I think it is mildly frustrating that I do not possess the sufficient wield of the English language in order to properly describe my experience of reading this novel. You might know Hardy from one of his more famous novels, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but when I read it, I will confess that I did not like it as much as I let on. So if anything, I was a little hesitant to read a lesser known Hardy novel, but after reading it, it quickly has become one of my most favorite and beloved novels of all time. This novel is equal parts about the rural countryside and the fast-moving city and its contrast, but also the contrast between our innermost thoughts and desires and what we present to others, swift passion and slow courtship, Mother Nature and human nature. And in the end, I think it's a really lovely, honest meditation of four people as they navigate life and love in the countryside. Oh, fun fact about this novel is that Katniss Everdeen, as you know from the Hunger Games, actually got her last name by the protagonist of this book, Bathsheba Everdeen. And Suzanne Collins writes in an interview, quote, "I rediscovered Hardy and consumed 4 of his novels in a row. Katniss Everdeen owes her last name to Bathsheba Everdeen, the lead character in Far from the Madding Crowd. The two are very different, but both struggle with knowing their hearts." Central to both The Hunger Games and to Far from the Madding Crowd is a story of a young woman who is pulled by her heart in multiple directions as she attempts to forge independence and to quite literally change the society around her. I think my favorite thing about this novel is just young Hardy as an author. He is such a passionate romantic writer. Because he's early in his writing career, his writing is not yet so finely controlled. He takes risks and digressions, often too belabored or plot too hurried, but in the end, I felt the acute pleasure of a young, ambitious author who is just enjoying and reveling in his ability to conjure characters and imagery and interactions by his mere wield of the English language. I think I would be really remiss if I did not point out how I think this novel has really lovely descriptions of light. As it filters in through the English countryside, or the dance of a flame across a quaint shepherd's lodgings, as it slants in from the slats of a sharing room roof. To read this novel is to fall in love with the way that Hardy sees the world, specifically as it is illuminated and refracted and reflected through light. One of my favorite passages of this novel is Hardy's meditation on time, and how time in Weatherbury, which is this sort of rural countryside, is different than the city. I'd love to read you this. Quote, "In comparison with cities, Weatherbury was immutable. The citizens then is the rustics now. In London, 20 or 30 years ago are old times. In Paris, 10 years or 5. In Weatherbury, 3 or 4 score years were included in the mere present, and nothing less than a century set a mark on its face or tone. In these Wessex nooks, the busy outsider's ancient times are only old. In his old times are still new. His present is futurity." This is one of my favorite passages from this novel because I think it asks a really important question of what is the nature of time. So, for example, for Aristotle, time was just a measurement of events passing. So if nothing had changed, no time would have passed. Then you have Newton, which argued no, time is an absolute entity. And even if nothing changes, there's always the inexorable ticking of the absolute clock. And now we understand the theory of relativity by Einstein, which argues that time is relative and non-constant. Time and space are interconnected, and massive objects warp the fabric of space-time. I think what's special to me is that this passage seems like Hardy's meditation on time, and the framework is almost understood only through the theory of relativity. I think through this passage emerges Hardy's proposition that there is a really important linking of space and time. And for me, that's just really exciting to see it through a more, not as scientific, but definitely more of a narrative lens, and how Hardy was kind of spot on that linking of the space-time fabric. Now I want to talk about To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This novel is full of movement and stillness in equal measure. Its depictions of nature and human nature alike, the treatment of narrative time, and most importantly, its unique mastery and foregroundedness of focalization. It felt akin to me like the unrelenting panning of a camera zooming in and out and in and out. So in and out of characters' minds, out toward the vast ocean, and back to the filaments of a paintbrush strewn across a grassy lawn. I think that's something that is so special about this novel, is that she is committed to painstakingly detailing the minutiae of character interactions and the lush and ever-changing landscape of the interior of a human mind as it perceives and interacts with others. What a joy and novel experience it is to read this novel that dwells so wholly on characters as interconnected beings in constant relationship, pushed and pulled by their quests for independence, and yet borne back each time by their inextricable dependence on others. She writes as I would imagine an empath experiences the world, always treading water amidst the rising and falling tide of human relationships and their ever-changing intricacies. Now I want to transition to talking about Pale Fire. As I mentioned, this novel at its core contains a 999-line poem. And so when I say that it is more poetry and prose, I mean that both lyrically in Nabokov's writing and mastery of his craft, but also in quite literally the medium. Just meditating a little bit more on the first two lines of the poem, "The eye was a shadow of the waxwing slain by the false azure in the window pane." I think this imagery of a bird, a common bird, a waxwing, that dies by flying into what they think is the sky, but is actually a window. There's something incredibly allegorical and hauntingly beautiful and devastating about that. I think we are all in some sort of way waxwings that are slain by the false azure of window panes, false azure of things that we think is the sky, but are just false mirages of them. And something about that is just incredibly evocative and has stayed with me. Let me just comment a little bit more on the unique narrative structure of this novel. So I mentioned that this is at its core a 999-line poem, which is written by a poet named John Shade, who this poem is compiled post-mortem by John's neighbor, Charles Kimboat, who writes the foreword and line-by-line commentary and the index on this poem. What is interesting is that both John Shade and Charles Kimboat are, of course, just figments of Nabokov's imagination, but while Charles Kimboat is writing this line-by-line commentary, the commentary, although it's supposed to be correlated with the lines of the poem, almost has no ostensible connection to the poem at all. They're kind of telling two different stories. I think what I love specifically about Pale Fire is that there are so many of these windows to see the book through, and yet there's so many false azures, because there is something incredibly subversive about the poem that is being compiled by this guy who is using the poem for his own means and yet oddly connected through it. And so you get two autobiographical depictions of these two very different men that are intermixed into this one medium. And it's so interesting because the way that you read this novel is by reading through the poem and then flipping to the back where Charles Kimboat is giving commentary about a completely different poem. You flip back and then you read this poem about a completely different story. And there are these really tenuous connections between the two. But then sometimes there emerges these sort of undeniable connections. And I think in this way, it's incredibly subversive. The narrative structure is the most unique that I think I've ever encountered in a novel. In conclusion, thank you so much for watching. Happy daylight savings. I hope that you use the extra hour today to rest and relax and maybe engage in some reading. If you do pick up any of these recommendations, I would love to hear what you thought. Or if you've read these before, I would love to hear your takes on these novels, how it was similar or different than mine. I just want to thank you so much for watching this video. If you feel inclined to like, comment, and subscribe, I would so appreciate it. But also genuinely just thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.